Brazil may be a vast and a widely known country, but the history of the state doesn't have much notable older ancient civilizations apart from Native Americans inhabiting the Amazon even today. The history starts when the Pope created the Treaty of Tordesillas for Spain and Portugal. Portugal got upset, so the line was moved westward a bit. There were many different people, Portuguese and Spanish people, who are said to have reached Brazil first, but it's more widely said that an expedition led by a certain Spanish navigator, one who accompanied Columbus in the first voyage, was the first to reach Brazil, and they reached the Cape of Santo Agostinho, which is in the current state of Pernambuco, on January 26, 1500. This is the oldest confirmed European landing in Brazilian territory. They were unable to claim the land because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. In April 1500, Brazil was claimed for Portugal on the arrival of the Portuguese fleet. The Portuguese encountered stone-using natives divided into several tribes, many of whom shared the same language family, and fought among themselves. Early names for the country include Santa Cruz and Terra dos Papagaios, and after European arrival, the land's major export was a type of tree the traders and colonists called pau Brazil, or Brazil wood, from which gave it its final name. Until 1529, Portugal had little interest in settling Brazil, mainly due to being focused on the high profits gained through the commerce with India, China, and the East Indies. This lack of interest allowed traders, pirates, and privateers of several countries to poach profitable Brazil wood in lands claimed by Portugal, with France setting up the shoreless colony of France Antarctique in 1555 in response the Portuguese crown devised a system to effectively settle Brazil through the hereditary captain system. Brazil was divided into strips of land that were donated to Portuguese noblemen, who were in turn responsible for the occupation and administration of the land and answer to the king. The system was later substituted to a dual-state government in 1572, where the country was divided into the northern government based in Salvador and the southern government based in Rio de Janeiro. The Portuguese Brazilian settlers introduced and propagated Old World cultures such as rice, coffee, sugar, cows, chicken, pigs, bread, wine, oranges, horses, sodomistry, metalworking, and guitars even. The Portuguese have favored assimilation and tolerance for other peoples, and intermarriage was more acceptable. Since colonial times, Portuguese settlers intermarried with indigenous and African populations, thus made the Brazilian population diverse since colonial times, with the most common mixtures occurring between whites, indigenous, and African populations. In present times, the largest ethnic groups are Brazilians of mainly European descent, which accounts for nearly one half of the population, while roughly the other half of the population are people of mixed ethnic background. The remaining racial composition of the population consists of entirely African ancestry, 7.6%, Asian, which accounts for nearly 1%, and indigenous, which accounts for only 0.4% of the population. In 1578, the young King Sebastian, King of Portugal, disappeared in a crusade in Morocco during a battle. The king had entered the war without much allied support or the necessary resources to fight properly. With his disappearance, and since he had no direct heirs, Philip II of Spain, who was his uncle, was the only successor and took the Portuguese administration in hand in 1580, in what was called the Iberian Union, which lasted 60 years. Later, in 1640, John IV of Portugal, Duke of Bragança, restored Portuguese independence and formed the third Portuguese royal dynasty, the House of Bragança. With the merging of the crowns in the Iberian Union, Portuguese/Brazilian settlers were legally allowed to cross beyond the Treaty of Tordesillas line, and thus more interior expansions of Brazil began, or at least officialized and cartographed during that period. Sebastian never returned, which originated the messianic line of thought Sebastianism, which would see the rightful king return from the mist and restore the kingdom to its former glory. Sebastianism permeates the Lusophone culture even today in different ways around the world. But a transformation is happening in Portugal in regards to how to approach and feel this prophecy/metaphor. In Brazil, the most important manifestation of Sebastianism took place in the context of the proclamation of the Republic, when movements defending a return to the monarchy emerged. A Tamoiral Confederation was a military alliance of aboriginal chieftains of the seacoast ranging from what is today Santos to Rio de Janeiro. which occurred from 1554 to 1567. The main reason for this rather unusual alliance between separate tribes was to react against slavery and wholesale murder and destruction brought by the early Portuguese discoverers and settlers of Brazil onto the people. Kunambi was elected chief of the Confederation by his counterparts, and together with other chiefs of the other tribes, they declared war on the Portuguese. Starting in the 16th century, sugarcane was grown on most plantations across the northeastern coast, which had Brazil as the #1 sugar producing place in the entire world, even above the Caribbean places. The Portuguese used the same slavery and workforce system as it did in Madeira and Sao Tome. The Dutch, being like they were, seized productive areas of northeastern Brazil from 1630 to 1654 and took them over. When the Dutch were expelled from Brazil following a strong push by Portuguese Brazilians and their indigenous and Afro-Brazilian allies, the Dutch as well as the English and French set up sugar production on the plantation model of Brazil and the Caribbean. Increased production and competition meant that the price of sugar dropped, and Brazil's market share dropped. Brazil's recovery from the Dutch insurgence was slow since warfare had taken its toll on sugar plantations, and Bahia tobacco was cultivated for the African export market. Who entered the jungle in search of gold and native slaves. However, colonists were unable to continually enslave natives, and Portuguese sugar planters soon turned to import millions of slaves from Africa. Mortality rates for slaves in sugar and gold enterprises were dramatic, and there were often not enough females or proper conditions to replenish the slave population through natural increase. Still, Africans became a substantial section of the Brazilian population, and long before the end of slavery, they had begun to merge with the European Brazilian population. During the first 150 years of the colonial period, attracted by the vast natural resources and untapped land, other European powers tried to establish colonies in several parts of Brazilian territory, in defiance of the Papal Bull and the Treaty of Tordesillas, which had divided the New World into two parts between Portugal and Spain. French colonists tried to settle in present-day Rio de Janeiro from 1555 to 1567, and in present-day São Luís in the northern part from 1612 to 1614. A Portuguese person arrived early and established Sao Paulo, evangelizing the natives. These native allies of the explorer assisted the Portuguese in driving out the French. The unsuccessful Dutch intrusion into Brazil was longer lasting and more troublesome to Portugal. Dutch privateers began by plundering the coast. They sacked Bahia in 1604 and even temporarily captured the old capital, Salvador. From 1630 to 1654, the Dutch set more permanently in the northwest and controlled a long stretch of the coast more accessible to Europe, in like Suriname, the Guiana's land, without, however, penetrating the interior. But the colonists of the Dutch West India Company in Brazil were in a constant state of siege, despite the presence and receipt of John Maurice of Nassau as governor. After several years of open warfare, the Dutch withdrew by 1654. The little French and Dutch cultural and ethnic influences remained of these failed attempts of the Portuguese, subsequently defending its coastline more vigorously. Slave rebellions were very frequent until the practice of slavery was abolished in 1888. When I say there was a lot, I mean a lot. There were a lot of slave rebellions. If I go over the notable rebellions, this video would be definitely over 30 minutes, minimum. So just know that there were plenty of slave rebellions. The discovery of gold in the early 18th century was met with great enthusiasm by Portugal, which had an economy in disarray following years of war against Spain and the Netherlands. A gold rush quickly ensued, with people from other parts of the colony and Portugal flooding the region in the first half of the 18th century. The large portion of the Brazilian inland where gold was extracted became known as the Minas Gerais, which is now the province name, which means general mines. Gold mining in this area became the main economic activity of colonial Brazil during the 18th century. In Portugal, the gold was mainly used to pay for industrialized goods, obtained from countries such as England. In Brazil, it resulted in the emergence of towns and cities that are today UNESCO World Heritage Sites. such as Ouro Preto, one of the biggest non-populous towns in the Americas during that period, and many other historical towns with lush architecture. Minas Gerais was the gold mining center of Brazil during the 18th century. Slave labor was generally used for the workforce. The discovery of gold in the area caused a huge influx of St. John Mining Company, controlled by the British, opened the largest gold mine in Latin America. The British brought in modern management techniques and engineering expertise. Located in Nova Lima, the mine produced ore for 125 years. Brazil was one of only three modern states in the Americas to have a monarchy. The other two were Mexico and Haiti for almost 90 years. As the Haitian Revolution for Independence against the French crown was taking place in the late 1700s, Brazil, then a colony of Portugal, was also on the verge of starting its own revolution for independence. In the early 1790s, plots to overthrow the Portuguese colonial government flooded the streets of Brazil. Poor whites, a few upper-class whites, freed persons, slaves, and mixed-race natives wanted to revolt against the Portuguese crown to abolish slavery, take power from the Catholic Church and all forms of racial operation, and establish a new governmental system that provided equal opportunities to all citizens. It would not be until September 1822 that the Portuguese prince would declare Brazil as its own independent empire. In 1808, the Portuguese court, fleeing from Napoleon's invasion of Portugal during the Peninsular War in a large fleet escorted by British men of war, moved the government apparatus to its then colony, Brazil, establishing themselves in the city of Rio de Janeiro. From there, the Portuguese king, John VI, ruled his empire for 15 years, and there he would have remained for the rest of his life if it were not for the turmoil aroused in Portugal, due, among other reasons, to his long stay in Brazil after the end of Napoleon's reign. In 1815, the king vested Brazil with the dignity of a united kingdom with Portugal and Algarves. In 1817, a revolt occurred in the province of Pernambuco. In 2 months, it was suppressed. When the king left Brazil to return to Portugal in 1821, his elder son, Pedro, stayed in his stead as regent of Brazil. 1 year later, Pedro stated the reasons for the secession of Brazil from Portugal and led the independence war, instituted a constitutional monarchy in Brazil, assuming its head as Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, and then returned to Portugal to fight for the constitutional monarchy, and against the abolitionists' usurper brother Miguel I of Portugal in the Liberal Wars. Brazil's independence was recognized with the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro in 1825. Brazil's territorial dimension as a nation was achieved before the independence by the Portuguese-Brazilian monarchy in 1822, with later some territorial expansion and disputes with neighboring Spanish ex-colonies, making Brazil the largest continuous territory in the Americas today. It is worth noting that before the independence, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil had been the capital of the Portuguese Empire for 14 years. Externally, apart from the independence war, stood out a decade of pressure from Great Britain for the country to end its participation in the Atlantic slave trade and the wars fought in the region of the Plata River, the Cisplatin War, the Plataean War, the Uruguayan War, and the Paraguayan War in the 1860s. This last war against Paraguay also was the bloodiest and most expensive in South American history, after which the country entered a period that continues to the present day. Averse to external political and military interventions, the major export crop in the 19th century was coffee, grown on a large-scale plantation in the Sao Paulo area. The Zona de Mata Mineira district grew 90% of the coffee in the Minas Gerais region during the 1880s and 70% during the 1920s. Most of the workers were black men, including both slaves and free. Increasingly, Italian, Spanish, and Japanese immigrants provided the expanded labor force. While railway lines were built to haul the coffee beans to market, they also provided essential internal transportation for both freight and passengers, as well as providing work opportunities for a large-scale labor force. By the early 20th century, coffee accounted for 16% of Brazil's gross national product and three-quarters of its export earnings. Coffee is what Brazil was known for. Throughout the rubber boom in the Amazon in the 1880s is the reason the most remote city in the Western Hemisphere exists, Manaus. After Pedro was robbed, a military coup took over the country and called the country the United States of Brazil, which was changed in 1967 to the Federative Republic of Brazil. The coup was not nice and they did not let women vote, rights were not as free, trading was more conservative, overall Brazil was not a good place to live in. After 1930, the successive governments continued industrial and agricultural growth and development of the vast interior of Brazil. Getulio Vargas led a military junta that was taking control in 1930 and would continue to rule from 1930 to 1945 with the backing of the Brazilian military, especially in the army. In this period, he faced internally the Constitutionalist revolt in 1932 and two separate coup attempts by communists in 1935 and by local right-wing elements of the Brazilian integralism movement in 1938. The Liberal Revolution of 1930 overthrew the oligarchic coffee plantation owners and brought to power an urban middle class and business interests that promote industrialization and modernization. Aggressive promotion of new industry turned around the economy by 1933. Brazil's leaders in the 1920s and 1930s decided that Argentina's implicit foreign policy goal was to isolate Portuguese-speaking Brazil from Spanish-speaking neighbors, thus facilitating the expansion of Argentine economic and political influence in South America. Even worse was the fear that a more powerful Argentine army would launch a surprise attack on the weaker Brazilian army. To counter this threat, the president forged closer links with the United States. Meanwhile, Argentina moved in the opposite direction. During World War II, Brazil was a staunch ally of the United States and sent its military to Europe. The United States provided over 100 million in Lend-Lease grants in return for free rent on air bases used to transport American soldiers and supplies across the Atlantic, and naval bases for anti-submarine operations. In sharp contrast, Argentina was officially neutral and at times favored Germany. A democratic regime prevailed from 1945 to 1964 in Brazil. In the 1950s, after Vargas' second period, the country experienced an economic boom during the next president's years, during which the capital was moved from Rio to Brasilia. Externally, after a relative isolation during the first half of the 1930s due to the effects of the 1929 crisis, in the second half of the 1930s, there was a rapprochement with the fascist regimes of Italy and Germany. However, after the fascist coup attempt in 1938 and the naval blockade imposed on these two countries by the British Navy from the beginning of World War II, in the decade of 1940, there was a return to the old foreign policy of the previous period. During the early 1940s, Brazil joined the Allied forces in the Battle of the Atlantic and the Italian campaign. In the 1950s, the country began in participation in the United States peacekeeping missions. With Suez Canal in 1956 and at the beginning of the 1960s during the presidency of Janio Quadros, its first attempts to break the automatic alignment that had started in the 1940s with the U.S. The institutional crisis of succession for the presidency, triggered by the Quadros resignation, coupled with external pressure from the United States against a more nationalist government, will lead to a military intervention in 1964 and the end of the period. Once to feign another military dictatorship known as the Fifth Republic, rolled from April 1964 to March 1985. I'm sure you've watched enough of these. You're tired of fearing these military dictatorships, so I'll move up past it. Elections arose after the military dictatorship, and Tancredo Neves was elected president in 1985. The nation returned to civilian rule and development across the whole area. Then until now was spent with a lot of economic growth and overall prosperity, with a few capitalist protests that don't matter much, and now Brazil is on their 39th president, slowly going into a regional power. The only other thing I will mention is that Brazil is one of the 5 founding members of BRICS, which was made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is a very big economic union between members, and more members are being added. That is it for the history of Brazil. Stats time. The area is around 8.5 million square kilometers. The population is around 220 million people. The GDP is about 2.2 trillion USD, and the GDP per capita is just about 10,000. That is it for the history of Brazil.